Grace Thompson believed she had found her second chance at happiness. Life with Andrew seemed ideal. He was everything she had hoped for in a partner after losing her first husband. Andrew was charming, generous, and seemed to genuinely care for her 19-year-old daughter, Sophie. Together, they created the image of a perfect family. Grace had worked hard to build a good life for Sophie, juggling long hours and personal sacrifices to ensure her daughter had every opportunity to thrive. When Andrew entered their lives, he seemed to fit seamlessly. He wasn't just a father figure to Sophie. He treated her as though she were his own child, often going out of his way to make her feel special. Sophie, though initially hesitant, appeared to warm up to Andrew over time. Outwardly, the Thompsons were enviable. Grace's friends admired her luck in finding love again. Their neighbors spoke highly of Andrew's generosity, Grace's warmth, and Sophie's intelligence. They were invited to every community event and celebrated as the epitome of success. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that Grace was too distracted to notice. Grace returned home earlier than expected from a business trip, excited to surprise her family. The house was unusually quiet. She expected to find Andrew working in his study or Sophie in her room, but as she climbed the stairs, she noticed Sophie's bedroom door slightly open. Voices murmured from inside. Peering through the narrow gap, Grace's world shattered in an instant. There, on Sophie's bed, were Andrew and Sophie, entangled in a betrayal she could never have imagined. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind tried to make sense of the scene. This wasn't just infidelity, it was something far more sinister, violating the trust that had bound them together as a family. Unable to confront them in the moment, Grace fled the house, her mind a whirlwind of shock, disbelief, and fury. She drove aimlessly through the night, replaying the scene in her mind. Questions plagued her. How long had this been happening? What had she missed? Was her love for Andrew and her trust in Sophie so blind? Grace's life became a waking nightmare. Every moment spent in the same house as Andrew and Sophie felt like a dagger to her heart, yet she swallowed her pain and maintained a facade of normalcy even as her emotions churned beneath the surface. She would watch them interact, every gesture now laden with sinister undertones. Andrew's casual touches, Sophie's nervous laughter. It was all too much, but Grace said nothing. Instead, she withdrew into herself, her silence masking the storm brewing inside her. At night, she lay in bed, unable to sleep. The images she had witnessed replayed in her mind like a broken record. Anger and grief consumed her. How could they betray her so profoundly? How could she have missed the signs? Her emotions vacillated between fury at Andrew for his predatory behavior and bitterness towards Sophie for betraying her trust. But Grace wasn't just heartbroken, she was calculating. She knew she couldn't confront them immediately. She needed time to understand the full extent of the betrayal and to decide how to exact justice. Grace's rage transformed into focus. The betrayal had wounded her, but it had also awakened a clarity she had never felt before. Andrew and Sophie's bond was a grotesque mockery of the family she had tried to build, and Grace resolved to dismantle it, piece by piece. She began to document everything. She installed a hidden camera in the living room and bugged Andrew's office, collecting evidence of their interactions. Late at night, she combed through Sophie's messages on their shared family laptop, finding traces of deleted conversations with Andrew. Each discovery deepened her resolve. Grace also studied Andrew. She noted his routines, his weaknesses, and his overconfidence. He believed his charm could smooth over any situation, and he underestimated Grace's intelligence. This would be his undoing. Her plan solidified when she remembered the remote cabin where they had spent a family vacation years ago. The location was perfect, isolated and surrounded by woods with no neighbors for miles. Grace suggested a getaway, framing it as a chance to reconnect as a family. Andrew readily agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to regain Grace's trust. Sophie, guilt-ridden and unsure, hesitated but eventually acquiesced. Grace packed the essentials, food, clothing, and tools she had carefully selected for her plan. A bottle of sedative wine was tucked into her bag, along with lengths of rope. She rehearsed every step in her mind, ensuring that nothing could go wrong. The journey to the cabin was weighed down by an almost tangible unease. Grace sat behind the wheel, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel, while Andrew lounged in the passenger seat, casually scrolling through his phone. Sophie, seated in the back, stared out the window, her face a mask of guilt and confusion. Andrew, ever the charmer, tried to fill the silence with anecdotes and jokes, jokes, but his voice grated on Grace's nerves. She responded with clipped nods and one-word answers, her mind focused entirely on the plan she had so carefully crafted. Sophie, uncharacteristically quiet, seemed to shrink into herself with every mile that passed. When they arrived, the cabin stood exactly as Grace remembered it, a rustic structure nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines and the distant murmur of a nearby stream. The serenity of the setting was almost mocking, given the storm brewing within Grace. Grace threw herself into the role of the dutiful hostess. She unpacked their belongings, prepared a simple but hearty meal, and lit a fire in the stone hearth. Andrew seemed to relax, his arrogance blinding him to the simmering tension. Sophie, however, was quieter than ever, her eyes darting nervously between Grace and Andrew. Dinner was an excruciating ordeal. Grace forced herself to smile and engage in small talk, her polite veneer hiding the volcanic rage bubbling beneath. Every glance between Andrew and Sophie felt like a slap to her face, but she held her composure, knowing the time wasn't right to act. As the evening wore on, Grace suggested a drink. She retrieved the special bottle of wine she had prepared, pouring generous glasses for all three of them. "To family," she said, raising her glass with a tight smile. Andrew grinned and clinked his glass against hers, oblivious to the trap he was walking into. The cabin's single lantern flickered, casting eerie shadows as Grace sat poised across from Andrew and Sophie, who were bound to their chairs. She was calm, unnervingly so, as if the act of tying them up had released some of her pent-up rage. The air was thick with the smell of smoke from the dwindling fire, mingling with the faint metallic tang of fear. "Do you know why we're here?" Grace's voice was low, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Her question hung in the air, unanswered. Andrew glanced at Sophie, his face pale, but neither spoke. Grace sighed, almost disappointed. Still lying even now? She picked up a photograph from the table, a candid shot of Sophie and Andrew at a cafe, their faces too close for it to be innocent. She held it up like evidence in a trial. "Explain this." Andrew's confident facade began to crack. "Grace, I swear, it's not what it looks like," he began, but she cut him off with a sharp laugh, cold and humorless. "Not what it looks like?" she echoed, slamming the photo down. Her eyes flicked to Sophie, who was trembling, tears streaking her face. "And you, Sophie? Nothing to say? I raised you. I trusted you." Sophie's sobs broke through. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry," she choked out, her words barely audible. Grace's heart ached at the sound, but her resolve didn't waver. Andrew, seizing the moment, began spinning his excuses, his voice rising with desperation. "Grace, we were drunk. It was a mistake. It meant nothing." "Enough!" Grace's voice thundered, silencing him. She grabbed the knife from the table, and though she didn't raise it, its presence was enough to send a chill through the room. "You don't get to explain away what you've done to me." She leaned in close to Andrew, her voice dropping to a whisper. "For years, you've lied, manipulated, and taken me for granted. And Sophie," her voice broke, but she steadied herself, "you were supposed to be my family." For a moment, Grace raised the knife, her knuckles white as her emotions reached a boiling point. The room was deathly silent except for the crackling of the fire. Then, with a cry of anguish, she threw the knife across the room. It clattered to the floor harmlessly, but its sound lingered like a thunderclap. The tension in the room reached a suffocating pitch. Grace stood frozen, her hands trembling with the raw emotions that coursed through her. Sophie, bound to the chair, looked at her mother with wide, terrified eyes. Andrew, still struggling against his restraints, looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The betrayal hung heavy in the air, thick with the years of secrets and lies that had led them all to this moment. For Grace, it felt like the world had stopped turning. Her heart had shattered, not only by the discovery of Andrew's affair, but by Sophie's complicity in the lie. Sophie, her daughter, the one person she had loved and trusted more than anyone. Her betrayal cut deeper than Andrew's. She had always been so protective of Sophie, believing that no matter what happened in their lives, their bond was unbreakable. But now, that illusion was shattered. She wasn't sure who Sophie was anymore. Her thoughts were interrupted by the low, desperate voice of Andrew. "Grace, please. You don't understand. It was a mistake, I swear. We were drunk." Grace's eyes flashed with fury. "A mistake?" she hissed, her voice trembling with emotion. "A mistake is when you forget to buy eggs at the store. This wasn't a mistake. This was a betrayal, a choice you made, over and over again." Andrew opened his mouth to argue further, but Grace silenced him with a look, her expression cold and final. "You think this is about the affair?" she continued, her voice dangerously calm. "It's not. It's about everything you've done to me, to us, the lies, the manipulations, the times you made me feel like I was nothing." Her breath hitched as the weight of it all came crashing down. Grace's entire existence had been built around a lie. The love she thought she had with Andrew had been a facade, and Sophie, her own daughter, had been a willing participant in it. The realization of how deep the betrayal ran threatened to consume her. She could feel the tears rising, but she swallowed them down. This wasn't the time for weakness. "You both need to understand something," she said, her voice low and filled with icy resolve. "I am done with both of you." Andrew's eyes widened in shock. He tried to stand, but his chair scraped loudly against the floor as he struggled. "Grace, please don't do this," he begged. "I'll do anything. We can fix this." "No!" Grace cut him off, her voice steel. "You don't get to fix this. You've already broken everything. There's nothing left." The words stung, and though she felt the weight of them deep in her chest, she knew they were true. She had reached her breaking point. There was no going back from this. Sophie began sobbing, her shoulders heaving with each painful breath. "Mom, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know what I was doing. I love you." Grace turned her back to them, a bitter smile curling on her lips. "You knew exactly what you were doing," she said. "But that's what hurts the most." She moved to the kitchen counter and grabbed a glass of water, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. She could feel the years of anger and grief building inside her, threatening to burst forth like a storm. But no matter how much it hurt, Grace knew that the storm was necessary. It was the only way she could reclaim her life from the wreckage they had made of it. The journey to redemption was neither fast nor easy, but it was the only path Grace could take if she was to reclaim her life. After the collapse of her marriage and the betrayal by Sophie, Grace found herself standing at a crossroads. She could have easily shut herself off from everyone, building walls around her heart, but deep inside, she knew that true healing required more than isolation. It required facing the past, acknowledging her pain, and choosing to move forward. Grace began to recognize that redemption wasn't just about seeking forgiveness from others, it was about forgiving herself. For years, she had placed the blame for her broken life solely on Andrew and Sophie, but now, in the quiet of her new home, she began to realize that she too had played a role in the unraveling. She had allowed herself to be complicit in the illusions of happiness they had created. She had neglected her own needs, burying her desires beneath the weight of her family's expectations. She had ignored the red flags, convinced herself that things would get better on their own. As she reflected on her life, Grace realized that redemption began with self-acceptance. She had to forgive herself for the mistakes she had made, both the ones she had control over and the ones that had been beyond her reach. She had married a man who wasn't capable of loving her the way she deserved, but that wasn't her fault. She had raised a daughter who had made choices that deeply hurt her, but that wasn't a reflection of her as a mother. It was a reflection of Sophie's own struggles. The painful truth was that Grace had always tried to be everything for everyone, never once considering what she truly needed. But now, in the aftermath of everything, she had the opportunity to rebuild, to rewrite her own story. Grace began by seeking therapy, not just for her relationship with Sophie, but for herself. She dug deep into her past, examining the roots of her own insecurities, fears, and emotional wounds. She began to understand how those wounds had shaped her choices and her perceptions of herself. The journey was painful, often bringing tears and moments of anger, but with each session, Grace felt herself shedding the weight she had carried for so long. Meanwhile, Sophie also began her own journey of redemption. She reached out to Grace more frequently, not just with apologies, but with a genuine desire to understand the depth of her mother's pain. Sophie had matured in ways Grace had not expected. She had started therapy as well, confronting the reasons behind her own reckless actions. She had been a young woman who had been seeking validation in the wrong places, but now, as she matured, she saw the immense damage she had caused, not only to her mother but to herself as well. Their conversations were difficult at first, fraught with emotion and uncomfortable silences. Sophie would express her sorrow, and Grace would listen, not with judgment but with compassion. The walls between them began to crumble, slowly at first, then faster as time passed. Sophie expressed regret not only for the affair but also for how she had abandoned her mother during her most vulnerable moments. "I was selfish, Mom," Sophie said one evening after a long conversation over dinner. "I was so focused on my own problems, I didn't see how much you were hurting." Grace, though still grieving, looked into Sophie's eyes and saw the genuine remorse there. For the first time, she believed her daughter was truly sorry. And for the first time, Grace allowed herself to feel hopeful again. Healing had begun, though they both knew it would take time. After the tumultuous period of her life, Grace stood on the edge of something profound, a new beginning. The pain, the heartbreak, the betrayal, it all seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the fresh possibility of what lay ahead. Her decision to move into a new home marked the physical manifestation of the transformation she had undergone. It was symbolic of her emotional journey, letting go of the past to create space for her future. The cottage she chose was modest, nestled in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by nature. It was nothing like the large house she had shared with Andrew, but it was perfect for her new life. The small garden in the front, filled with flowers she had always loved, became her sanctuary. Each day, Grace spent time nurturing the plants, watching them bloom as she did the same for herself. This act of tending to something living gave her a sense of purpose and grounded her in the present moment. Grace had made the conscious decision to step away from the life she had known, the life that had been defined by Andrew's expectations and Sophie's rebellion. She realized that in order to move forward, she had to remove herself from the environment that had been soaked with the shadows of her past. The cottage became a place where Grace could breathe, a space where she could rediscover herself and heal from years of neglect. At first, the solitude felt overwhelming. Grace had always been part of a family unit, wife, mother, and now she was on her own, for the first time in many years. There were moments of loneliness, but they were tempered with a quiet sense of peace. She wasn't completely isolated. She maintained regular contact with Sophie, though their relationship was still healing. It was in these quieter moments that Grace began to rediscover herself. She took long walks, spent time in nature, and most importantly, started to understand what she truly wanted in life. The hobbies and dreams she had abandoned in favor of family obligations began to resurface. Art, something she had always loved but never had time to pursue, became her refuge. Grace took up painting again. Her first canvas was a chaotic mix of colors, symbolizing the emotional storm she had weathered. But as the months passed, her paintings grew more structured, more serene. The act of creating became a form of therapy for her, helping her to process her emotions and regain a sense of control over her life. She also began to explore new interests. She joined a local yoga class to heal her body, which had been neglected during the years of emotional turmoil. It was more than just physical exercise. Yoga taught her the importance of mindfulness, of being present in her own body and letting go of old patterns of thought. Through yoga, Grace learned to quiet her mind and reconnect with herself in a way she hadn't been able to for years. With every new step she took toward healing, Grace found that she was becoming someone new. Her resilience had been tested, but she emerged stronger, more self-aware, and more self-reliant than she had ever been. It was a journey of self-discovery, of learning to embrace her individuality, her strength, and her worth. Sophie, too, was undergoing her own transformation. After the emotional fallout, Sophie had sought therapy and was gradually gaining clarity about her own life. Their conversations, once strained and painful, began to shift. They could now talk about their past without the bitterness that had once defined their interactions. Sophie apologized for her actions, acknowledging the hurt she had caused, and Grace forgave her, not just for the affair, but for the years of emotional distance they had created between them. Slowly, Grace and Sophie began to rebuild their relationship, this time from a place of mutual respect and understanding. The healing process was slow and not without setbacks. They both had moments where old wounds resurfaced, but they learned how to navigate them with patience and empathy. They realized that their relationship would never be perfect, but it could be real, built on the foundation of honesty, trust, and love. Grace no longer had unrealistic expectations of Sophie. She understood that her daughter had her own path to walk, and while Grace was always there to offer support, she would no longer try to shape Sophie's life or force her to live up to any idea of who she thought she should be. The changes in Grace's life were not just about creating a new routine or finding new hobbies. They were about embracing her true self, unencumbered by the past. In doing so, she opened herself up to the possibility of new relationships, new experiences, and a deeper connection with herself. As time passed, the person who emerged from the ashes of Grace's old life was someone transformed. The pain of her past had not disappeared, but it no longer held the same power over her. Healing, she had learned, was not an event or a destination. It was a process, one that unfolded slowly, like a flower blooming in its own time. Grace had come to understand that healing wasn't linear. There were moments of profound growth, followed by times when the wounds reopened, and she was once again forced to confront the pain. But each time she grew stronger, more resilient, more accepting of herself. As time passed, the person who emerged from the ashes of Grace's old life was someone transformed. The pain of her past had not disappeared, but it no longer held the same power over her. Healing, she had learned, was not an event or a destination. It was a process, one that unfolded slowly, like a flower blooming in its own time. Grace had come to understand that healing wasn't linear. There were moments of profound growth, followed by times when the wounds reopened, and she was once again forced to confront the pain. But each time she grew stronger, more resilient, more accepting of herself. She no longer blamed herself for the choices others had made, nor did she let guilt dictate her path forward. She had learned that healing required compassion, not just for others but for herself. The anger and bitterness that once consumed her slowly dissolved into acceptance. Grace had forgiven Andrew, not for his sake, but for hers. She realized that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and hoping the other person would die. It only hurt her in the end. By forgiving Andrew, she released herself from the chains that had bound her for so long. This forgiveness allowed her to reclaim her peace. As for Sophie, their relationship continued to evolve. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but they had come to understand one another in ways they hadn't before. Grace no longer expected Sophie to live up to some idealized image of what a daughter should be. She loved Sophie for who she was, with all her flaws and imperfections, and Sophie in turn began to respect her mother in ways she hadn't before. She had witnessed Grace's transformation, seen her strength, and understood the depth of the sacrifices her mother had made for her. Grace's life outside of her family also flourished. She became an active member of her community, connecting with people who shared her passions. She started teaching art classes at a local community center, helping others discover their own creative voices. Her art, once a private endeavor, now had a purpose beyond her own healing. It inspired others. She found fulfillment in this, knowing that her journey could serve as a light for others who were struggling to find their way. Most importantly, Grace learned to embrace the beauty of imperfection. She no longer sought validation from others or measured her worth by her ability to meet external expectations. She had come to understand that her worth was inherent, not dependent on anyone's approval. With each passing day, she grew more comfortable in her own skin, knowing that her journey was hers alone, and it was a beautiful one. On quiet evenings, Grace would sit on her porch, watching the sunset, reflecting on how far she had come. Her life was no longer defined by the mistakes of the past or the people who had hurt her. It was defined by her ability to heal, to grow, and to move forward. She had rediscovered the hope that had once been dimmed, and now, with the peace she had cultivated within herself, Grace looked to the future with excitement. Whatever came next, she was ready. Her story was no longer one of despair. It was one of resilience, of strength, and of the endless possibility of hope. Every challenge she had faced, every tear she had shed had brought her to this moment, and now she understood that this was just the beginning of the rest of her life.